Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology Podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Michael Tonry. Professor Emeritus Michael Tonry retired in December 2021 and was the McKnight Presidential Professor of Criminal Law and Policy. He was director of the Institute on Crime and Public Policy of the University of Minnesota. Previously, he was Professor of Law and Public Policy and director of the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge University. He has been the president of the American and European Societies of Criminology. He has also been visiting professor at several universities and research institutes. He has been the editor of Crime and Justice series. He had many research interests such as racial disparities in punishment. This interview was conducted on the 2nd of May 2023.
Michael Tonry, welcome. I'm really happy to have you here with us.
Welcome, Michael Tonry. As an old retired guy from the U.S., I'm hugely flattered to be invited by two people so important as you do to talk about things.
Well, thank you for joining us from Elba today. So the goal of this podcast is to talk about criminology in. Usually we put the focus on in Europe, but your case is perfect because you've been in many places in Europe, in America, in different countries in Europe. So, but to start somewhere with a concrete point, I thought that we could go back to the first issues of Crime and Justice, a review of research that you have been publishing for 50 years right now. And I think that there was this issue, 1981, if I am correct, with the historian Gurr, G-U-R-R, in which you show, there was the discussion, if I was informed about this correct, about crime going up in the U.S., and then Gurr enters the field with that article, showing that indeed violence was going down since the Middle Ages, and he introduces also the ideas of Norbert Elias. How did you find this person? How did you manage to mix the historians with the criminologists?
Crime and Justice was started in 1976 by the National Institute of Justice under a different name because its work had been critiqued by the American National Academy of Sciences, which said, this agency spends a huge amount of money, mostly wastes it. Not much of what they fund is very good, and even the good things are fugitive. Nobody knows what they are. And so the National Institute of Justice decided to establish two new publication series. One would be an annual review of research. One would be called the Evaluation Review on evaluation research. Crime and Justice was the annual review, and as you know, it's now in its 52nd volume. The Evaluation Review never made it to a second volume. Now, when it was established, Norval Morris and I were asked if we would be willing to edit it. And as editors, we wanted to have an editorial board of people from a wide array of disciplines to help us identify what the most exciting areas were in which there were important new developments in research, preferably with some kind of policy implications. So we put together a Noah's Ark. We had Dan Glaser, who who was a very prominent sociologist. Lloyd Olin, another prominent sociologist. Albert J. Rees Jr. Okay, so we've covered sociology. We decided we wanted to have a political scientist. And so we looked around to see who was doing work on crime, who was a political scientist, and Ted Robert Gurr's name here. Now, Gurr actually is a political scientist, not a historian, so he was on our editorial board. So basically, I turned and looked at the guy sitting in the next chair and said, would you be interested in writing an article on something? Gurr, however, got into this in the 1960s when he was working for a task force for the President's Commission on Crime and Law Enforcement. And it had a task force on historical work. 10 guys wrote review essays on various facets of the history of crime, and Gurr undertook for that, as a very young guy, a postdoc, to pull together the work by historians on the quantitative work by historians on crime in earlier times. And so for that, he wrote the first version of an overview of what we know about crime patterns over time. He did well. The National Justice funded him in the early 70s actually to put together a big project with Graubart from Australia, somebody from Sweden, somebody from England, and Gurr to look at the history of crime in those four countries. And they published a big book in about 1977 that indicated what they knew. 1977, we started Crime and Justice, and we had Ted Gurr on our board. So we said, Ted, would you be willing now to step back and just give the world an overview of what you think is now known about the evolution of crime over time? And of course, he said, as you guys know, that if we get much beyond our own time, it's very difficult to find any reasonably valid indicators of crime, except homicide. So he wrote that paper for Crime and Justice that was published in 1981, maybe, you said, 81, 82, that pulled together all of the work on the history of crime. And in it, they considered a bunch of graphs that shows scatter charts of points in which various historians calculated homicide rates for 30 years in Kent and England in the 14th century. And he just pulled all that together and got up with many pictures showing the steep long-term decline in homicide rates, which in turn inspired Manuel Eisner as a graduate student to try to look at it in a much more systematic way. So if you look back at Ted Gurr's figures, both in his 1977 book and in the Crime and Justice article, they're really pretty primitive, right? They almost have been done longhand, and because they don't look high-powered and polished and so on, although they tell an interesting story, and it's the story that turns out to be true. So that's a long-winded answer to your explanation.
Yeah. Then we see the whole picture about that, because it's something that has been with the Crime and Justice for with the articles of Manuel also that has been there. And your idea, I mean, we reach, especially in Europe, very low levels of homicide. Can this still continue to go down, or have we reached a limit?
Well, I have no idea, of course. My guess is it'll probably go down a little more because we probably haven't reached maximum potential of traumatic medical care. The major American historians who've done the history of violence in America, they claim on the basis of the now 50 articles on the effects of changes in trauma care on homicide rates, they claim that homicide rates in the 21st century are a third to a half lower everywhere than they would otherwise be because of advances in trauma care. The big advance was from the 60s to the 90s. But there were steady advances, even in the 19th century. Once you start developing things like ambulances, and various kinds of sedatives that can calm people down and so on. So if the European standard rate is about 1 now, maybe it'll go to 0.8, or is it 0.008 or 0.0? It's hard to imagine it can go 0.
Yeah, exactly. You cannot.
Human beings are human beings, and they have conflicts and some venal material ambitions that are advanced by killing people. So those things probably are not going to change. And domestic stuff is going to continue to happen, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. In the figures that we have for Switzerland, in the case of women, the women killed, then you don't see this huge decrease. So that number is a little bit more stable. And that is something also that is a new subject. When I've been looking a little bit at the topics of crime and justice, of course, it's a lot of years. But let's say this issue of femicide arrives quite late, and especially in Europe, the percentage of femicides becomes bigger because the overall number of homicides is going down.
Right.
About these subjects that enter into the field at one moment, which would be for you, let's say, we talk about trends. This is one topic that goes all over crime and justice. And are there any other topics that you see that are constant, that have followed the...
victimization studies. Now, once again, this will sound terribly Americanly parochial, but as I'm sure you know, since you've worked a lot on big surveys, the first serious victimization surveys were conducted by two men named Al Bitterman and Al Reese, separate ones, again for the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice in the 1960s in the U.S. Bitterman did the first representative national population victimization survey, although it focused on, that's an exaggeration, they actually mostly went on metropolitan areas. And Reese did a commercial victimization survey. And from that, in due course, comes the U.S. National Crime Victimization Survey. A few years later, the British Crime Survey. And a few years later, in a bunch of other places, countries started doing victimization surveys. And as you know, eventually there were some follow-up, less sophisticated international victimization surveys and some international self-report surveys. Let's start. It has a beginning. We commissioned Richard Sparks, Richard F. Sparks, the sensationally smart man who was at Cambridge in the 1960s and 70s, do a survey of victimization research. And that probably appeared in about the same volume as the Robert Gurr survey. And since then, we've probably done 4 or 5, 6 victimization survey articles. And for the next volume, we've commissioned a paper on victimization through the life course. Usually victimization surveys aren't interested in documenting the experiences of victims in a particular time period. So in 2023, did any of the following things happen to you?
Yeah.
And people give answers, and if they say yes, then there's some follow-up questions. And somebody compiles all that data. At the end of the year, 2 years later, they say, and the rate for this offense was X per 1,000 people over age 16 under the following circumstances. Well, we now have an article in which someone has taken victimization survey data but followed up with victims over time to see what the effects are on victims' later lives throughout the life course of having been the victim of a serious crime. So that's another, there's a through line, crime trends, there's a through line of victimization stuff. There was for a very long time a through line of developments in police research.
Yeah.
There's certainly been a through line in primarily American sentencing and punishment policies. A lot of empirical articles, a few normative articles, but they appeared in each of the last. But we're in our 5th decade. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's
At least 80s. Yeah. We're in our 6th decade. 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, 10s, and now 20s.
Yeah. No, and also you have every year, I mean, the position in which you have been all this time is that you could see whatever was going on, and have an overview of everything, which is like you're like a sort of walking encyclopedia.
And that's why I kept doing it, because I realized very early on that I was in the remarkably privileged position that someone was giving me money. I had money from the U.S. federal government for 27 continuous years. Pay staff, to pay me for some of my time, to pay writers, to pay reviewers. I had money to do that. And for me, it was just this remarkable opportunity with collaboration with members of an editorial board, which was pretty active for the first 35 years, to ask myself, what would I really like to know about? Who are the people who really know about it? Why don't I ask them to tell me? And so I have everything we commission is not just Michael's idiosyncratic interests, of course.
Yeah.
But the opportunity, I mean, so if I'm interested in long-term crime trends, to have Ted Robert Gurr pull together the state of knowledge as it existed in the 1980s, and then again, and as I know, that became an absolutely classic article that is still cited.
Yeah.
And then again in 2003 to ask Manuel Eisner, who made the next huge advance, to do the same thing in crime and justice, is a wonderful luxury. And then, as you know, I later on decided to indulge myself by publishing an entire book in which I got smart people to talk about a lot of things about long-term trends in crime and short-term trends. Yeah. So the reason I've done it is selfish. It's great fun and a wonderful opportunity to have smart people tell you things you'd like to know.
Yeah.
So here's the answer.
Yeah. And I mean, there is all this knowledge there, and the link you also had, and you taught in Lausanne criminal policy also for some time. The link between the research and the criminal policies. I know, for example, that you guided a group of American, I think they were politicians and people from the Senate, to show them how prison works in Germany, if I recollect correctly.
That was a guided tour with foundation funding, and became the subject of I think a 2-hour program on what was then the most high visibility American news program called 60 Minutes. Yeah. And we got some governors, we got some conservative prosecutors, we got representatives of the most conservative right-wing political funders, the Koch brothers, as they are named. One of them's dead now. We took 20 people to Germany just to show them, actually, it's possible to do this in other ways than the Americans did. And to our amazement, a couple of people went back and made fairly serious, well, it powerfully influenced the Koch Foundation's representative, because they then became one of the major funders and action initiators prison policy reform in the U.S. So that certainly worked with him. A couple of state corrections commissioners went back and changed things they were doing in their state system, because it was absolutely eye-opening to people who are professional politicians, left and right, to be asked to be in a German prison with a couple hundred inmates, and to ask the warden, a woman lawyer who had been a judge but somehow became a prison governor, you don't really think you're changing these people, do you? They're going to go out and do exactly the same stuff when they're out that they did before. And she said, in a way that was not pretentious and not self-righteous, she said, if I believed that, I would quit this job tomorrow. I believe that the things that we do in this place change people's lives. And all right, that's good from a client perspective. But to me, what's more important, is that we change people's lives. We enable people to live different kinds of lives, maybe than they might have ever lived anyway, but then they were living when they got into sufficiently serious trouble that German judges decided they should be sent to prison. And that really moved people. One sarcastic guy tried to give a flippant response to that, and she soberly said something back. And afterwards, as we were on a bus flying away, I could hear a conversation going on among some of these politicians about that. Should we really take that seriously? Does that woman have the slightest idea what she's talking about? And one or two of them said, well, probably she does. But we don't spend the money, and we frankly don't have that kind of quality of people running prisons in the U.S. To make that something that's realistic in the United States. But I'll take her at face value. So I've done a variety of things working with practitioners on policy subjects.
Yeah, because that reminds me of a movie by Michael Moore, which is called Where to Invade Next, in which he goes, I don't know if it's right, he goes to different countries in Europe to take the best. And for example, he goes to Italy for the holiday system. He goes to Slovenia for the educational system. He goes to France for the food at schools. He goes to Germany to see how they teach the Holocaust. And so he takes the best and to bring it back. And I think that you are in a position in which you could make that the Europeans learn from some things that are well done in America, and vice versa, show the Americans some things that are done in a different way in Europe. This I knew.
We don't used to do that. I've spent so much time in Europe, partly because I actually decided that the U.S. was too conservative a place in the early 1970s, and I left, I thought, permanently. And taught in England for a while. Then my then wife's father got very sick, and we had to go back. But I met a lot of young British academics, which is what began my personal network relationships in Europe. But in the early 1990s, after having spent about 10 years doing really extensive American law reform work, there have been now 25, but there were then 6 or 7 agencies called sentencing commissions that were establishing sentencing rules for individual states in the federal system. I worked with every one of them for those 10 years, and probably had some influence and made some things less awful than they might have been. But it became clear in the early 1990s that the politics of crime was such that nobody wanted to hear from people like me. Yeah, I'm a liberal, but I'm basically a technocrat. These are the things you want to accomplish. These are the tools in your toolkit. Here's what we know about the effectiveness of each one of these tools for accomplishing something. And American policymaking just wasn't interested in that then. It was mostly ideological and mostly opinion surveys that were guiding American policy. And just political self-interest. So I, for about 10 years, started doing consulting work in Europe. So I worked with the British government a number of times. I worked with the Dutch government a number of times. I was a consultant in some Scandinavian countries on various facets of sentencing and correctional policy. And that was great fun. For me to be basically a middle-of-the-road, moderate kind of person, but liberal and a proceduralist, for me to be able to work with the Ministry of Justice of Helmut Kohl's conservative government in Germany and discover that we were all speaking the same language, because being conservative government did not mean mindless ideology. It did not mean severity for its own sake. It did not mean lots of posturing to make symbolic statements about something. And that was true in England until the early 1990s as well. So I did a fair amount. That's why I was able to do a fair amount of work in England and some work in Canada. So for 8 or 10 years, I did a fair amount of work in Europe, bringing some American, not trying to, of course, to sell American merchandise to European policymakers, but to be a vehicle for communicating knowledge about things that work. So, for example, a man named Noble Morris and I did a book a long time ago called Between Prison and Probation, what were then called intermediate punishments. They weren't simply unsupervised probation, and they weren't being locked in a room. And so we reviewed all of the evidence about what works and what doesn't work and so on. And one of the things we learned in America was that if new programs are created that are meant to serve as alternatives to imprisonment by whoever creates them, at least in America, judges will often view them as an additional resource available to them. And since in America there was relatively little experience with good community punishments, when new good community punishments were started, judges tended to prefer to use them for people they otherwise would have sent to regular probation, rather than to divert people from prison into them. And so the early research findings were consistent implementation failure. Program is set up, it's funded, people are staffed, judges receive the cases, but then judges misuse the new program. Now, from the judge's perspective, of course, he or she was not misusing the program. They were doing something sensible, they thought, where it was the offender who would benefit from it. And so I did some work in the Netherlands where they were trying to figure out a way to get some people out of prison. And the advice was, well, if you want to create alternative punishments that are genuinely going to serve as prison valves, that is, to reduce the use of imprisonment, you're smarter probably to not put it in the hands of judges, but in the hands of correctional authorities. Because with judges, you don't know what they're going to do. They may do what the Americans did, fully or partly, in which case your goals will be frustrated. But if you make it an early out program, rather than a diversion from in program, you'll be able to use it for the right kinds of people. And the Dutch government, the parliament enacted a law for a completely unsuccessful innovation called penitentiary sanctions. They were called penitentiary sanctions because they were community punishments, but they were community punishments to which people were released early, sometimes exceptionally early, from prison. The problem was that the prison authorities bought into that and thought it was great, but the planning work had not been done with the people who ran probation and community programs in the Netherlands, and they resisted and resented because they weren't given enough, they thought, additional funding and support to handle these new programs. They were just being asked to help reduce the prison budget by receiving people who otherwise would have been in prison. And there were some evaluations, and they showed that the take-up was very low because of the resistance from the community correctional people, and was eventually abandoned. But at least it was a good idea at the time, and I just give it as an example of taking evidence from the U.S., where there's always, but in the last 40 years, been a much more extensive, sophisticated, quantitative evaluation research tradition than in Europe. So here are some things we learned, as some implications, and here's an implication. just turned out it wasn't transferable. Or you could say it just wasn't implemented well.
No, but that is a clear difference. The idea of evaluating the results is much more established in the American system than in Europe. You have been there and here. Is there any reason why this idea of measuring?
I find it a mystery, but it may be. Well, in the 1990s, I was a fairly regular speaker at EU expert meetings. No, not expert meetings. When they would have meetings of ministers of justice or ministers of the interior, or I went to probably 10 of those and gave talks and participated in talking sessions. And when crime prevention was discussed, I was astonished at how amateurish much of this discussion was. I remember in particular there was a meeting held in Amsterdam, now held in a place I can't pronounce with a name like Scheveningen, which is a coastal town outside of Amsterdam. Only Lieven can say. There's a guy there named Erwin Waller, who then headed a victims research center in Canada, and he gave this speech with beautiful slides or PowerPoints, probably before PowerPoints, in which he was saying, oh, and if you do this, you can reduce recidivism by 80%, and if you do that, you can... And there was nothing behind it. And I actually, at a meal later on with the Minister of Justice of the Netherlands and a bunch of people who had organized the meeting, that guy's a charlatan. How on earth did you get him? And the minister was a woman named Winnie Swordranker, the Minister of Justice. Michael, we fund him. And people can hear you. And I found that a mystery. Because here I just done this big book on drawing on empirical work also from England, which had a good tradition of empirical evaluation research until the 1990s. Here's my hypothesis. In the U.S., right-wing politicians, and unfortunately because they've influenced the ear that everybody breathes, a lot of center politicians, instinctively long believed that harsh penalties have powerful deterrent effects, that if you want to be responsible in advancing public safety, you have to get dangerous people off the streets, and that sending a lot of people to prison is a good way to send moral messages and increase public safety. And so they didn't want to hear from people like me saying, well, or the American National Academy of Sciences saying, well, actually, the evidence on deterrence is very They didn't want to hear it because they knew what they wanted to do. I've been struck in Europe that, thank goodness, in most countries, most of the time, most people, including professionals, who think about the criminal justice system, believe that deterrence doesn't work. I can cite 8 different European government publications by expert groups or by committees or commissions or Ministry of Justice or Ministry of the Interior research groups, including that punishments don't have meaningful deterrent effects. Sometimes there's very little basis for saying it. But what they believe, they were writing reports that expressed their belief in things. And I think the same thing is true of community penalties. It is to say, an awful lot of people in Europe, except for the most lunatic fringe on the right, think, well, in general, sending people to prison is a bad thing. It's a miserably unpleasant experience. It can complicate people's lives in ways that, analytically speaking, don't make a lot of sense. You have people who already are living troubled lives. To give them more problems to deal with isn't likely to be an effective way to make their lives less troubled. But I think the intuition is there that therefore avoiding prison is a good thing, sending people, doing other things with people is a good thing, sometimes symbolically so that it can be seen that there were consequences for behavior. Sometimes if you can if you can direct people into programs or facilities or services that might be useful for them, in a cognitive skills training or some kinds of vocational training or drug alcohol dependence treatment programs, that's a good thing. So I think the answer is the American intuition, because of our great shift to the political right in the 1970s, from which we've never turned back, is that severity, harshness work, and while they may at some human way be regrettable, they're justifiable. And by and large, less so in England than elsewhere, a European attitude that, well, manipulating sanctions isn't really likely to make a huge difference in behavior on the streets and in the houses. Sending people to prison is pretty destructive and expensive. It makes a lot more sense in countries that still have reasonably strong social welfare systems to think of this as in large part a social welfare program and approach it in that way. So again, that's my long-winded reply.
I wanted to add something. I think what strikes me in the European context is that there is also some kind of resistance towards evaluation, also in progressive circles. But then I'm talking about crime preventive measures, especially progressive politicians and practitioners are afraid of being evaluated because it might be misused or abused by right-wing government to just stop financing a program, for example. This is another kind of...
Well, that's consistent with what I just said. It adds a gloss to it. Well, it used to be that right-wing politicians in the U.S. were unsympathetic to funding sophisticated evaluation of things like gun control strategies. For a few. Well, they knew it wouldn't make it would work, but by golly, if the results showed it did work, we don't want that either. So it's a parallel to what you're describing. I've been really always surprised that at some of these ministers' meetings I was mentioning in the 1990s, I remember there was a lot of discussion of France and Denmark as two countries that had especially well-developed community crime prevention methods and approaches. And they had state functionaries who had jobs that were in the crime prevention office or corps. But when I would ask or gently inquire, well, what's the evidence this makes any difference at all? It turned out almost nothing had ever been evaluated because it was just taken for granted that it was a good thing. Maybe the reason why there was such a more extensive evaluation industry in the U.S. is that a lot of public officials were funding things that it's probably not going to work. So we may as well establish that and not throw away good money after bad. And in Europe, if you were thinking about a problem like emotional problems of children with some apparent degree of mental instability in early childhood, that's a problem. And what can we do about it? Well, maybe we could have visiting nurse programs in general, and put in the standard list of items the visiting nurses are supposed to be attentive to signs of mental instability or erratic behavior or age-inappropriate behavior. And maybe, if we can identify things like that, we can establish other programs of interventions to deal with. So, if you go through that process, I don't know of any program like I know visiting nurses exist in many countries. Whether there are special programs for children at high risk of mental instability, I don't know. But I could easily imagine that there are such things, that people designing them wouldn't say, well, okay, but let's take 3 years and set up 3 pilot projects and run them for 1.5 years and evaluate them and see what difference it makes before we decide whether to invest in the program to create a new template for the big work of visiting nurses. Because it's obvious that's a big problem. We ought to try to do something about it. The worst case is what we'll do isn't very effective, or we'll lose a little money. But it feels right. It feels right. And so my guess is that a lot of the things in Europe just feel right. And in addition, if you think they feel right, you might do it without spending a lot of money evaluating it at a time. But you might sometimes be anxious about the problem that Lieven just described. Well, if we get too rigorous about this, it might turn out it doesn't make a difference, in which case we'll have to then try to justify continuing to fund the 20% investment in budgets for visiting nurses that were predicated on their ability to help identify early childhood mental instability problems. So yeah, that makes sense. But it's really the same phenomenon. If you're pretty confident in what you're doing makes sense, then why have spent a whole lot of money to establish what you already know makes sense? The problem with that is, of course, I'm sympathetic. My work for Marcelo Samini for 20 years headed a crime prevention agency in the government of Emilia-Romagna. So and I'm sure did lots of good things. But the problem with not investigating things, because it's just obvious they're going to work, is that that's the logic of 3 strikes and you're out laws in the U.S. Right? That's the logic of mandatory minimum sentence laws. That's the logic of sexual predator laws. That was the logic, but it's the logic of a lot of things that aren't very nice. And as to which in the U.S. now we pretty convincingly know don't work, which is part of the reason why with a 2 or 3 decade lag, there are the beginnings of signs of meaningful change in policy directions in the U.S. Because almost nobody any longer says, well, we know harsher penalties deter behavior. We know that if there's any effect, it's modest, oftentimes offset by criminalization effects, and that it just is not a valid basis to be spending a lot of money and doing a lot of injury. And that's finally beginning to sink in, even in all but the first bright political minds. Yeah. But I guess the difference is that sending people to prison for 25 years, or locking them up indefinitely because by some definition they are sexual predators, does demonstrable harm to people in big ways. Whereas, wasting, close quote, 20% of your visiting nurse budget on a new mental health add-on doesn't really hurt anybody. Now, but that's too fast, isn't it? I'm sorry, because it may well be that you create the risk of labeling. Maybe nowadays lots of kids are being identified as autistic who probably aren't. Well, who probably are in terms of indicators. But autism, like any condition, is a continuum of behavior. My guess is that a significant number of very successful academics, not one of whom I will name, are probably moderately advanced in autism scales. Lack emotional affect, don't have a huge amount of emotional intelligence, etc., 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 but are very smart, very analytical, very able to do things. And there are people who have autism for whom it's a seriously dysfunctional condition. And there are people who are on the other side of my academic friends, who I won't name, who, so they're at the 10.1 scale, on the 10-point scale, autism. Well, whether it's a good thing to take people who are at 0.1 and 0.15 and 0.2 and give them the label of autistic at age 2 is not obviously a good thing, since through most of human history, it's only the people who are at age 0.7 or 0.8 now, or at least recognized to have really serious behavioral challenges to face in their lives that other people don't. So there could be some downsides, and a completely rational approach to policy would say, well, okay, we may have helped 10% of all children, and we may have hurt 4% of all children. And we want to try to figure out how to get better at targeting both of those groups, but that's a price worth paying. Yeah. And if you don't ask the questions, you never learn that, and you never have that discussion.
Yeah. There is another thing that's interesting. For 50 years, we've been discussing with criminologists. You met all the ones that develop theories, and this is more Lieven's field. What do you think? Because you have been always almost an insider, but also an outsider. Because you didn't really. You've been doing criminology for a long time, but also with the background in different things. What is your opinion based on all your discussions about our explanations of crime? The main theories in criminology.
I think it has to do with the astral sign of the mother and the moon under which the child was born. You're out of an area in which I have any confidence at all. Actually, we have a couple of theory things coming out in Crime and Justice in the next issue. But ideological theory is just not something I've ever worked on. I frankly never quite understood why it preoccupies criminologists so much. Because why anybody would want... David Farrington, when he won the Sutherland Award, or maybe it was when he was the president of the ASC, he would talk. And he put up on a huge screen a single slide that for a while he naively and mistakenly referred to as the Farrington model because it was one of these diagrams that shows 30 or 40 nodes. Here's an individual difference side, here's a community side, here's a political context side, and on this big screen, and there are continua of those, and there are nodes scattered all over this thing, and then arrows going back and forth. Big arrows for big effects, little arrows, thin arrows for thin effects, arrows in different directions, and I remember thinking, what on earth is David ever going to do with that? What does the world get? Even if you could get the right coefficients for all of those areas. All right, now what do you do? And to some extent, people especially spent their whole career in trying to model causal hypotheses about human behavior in relation to crime are, I think, working on their parts of the David Farrington model. And I don't quite understand that. I understand why we want to answer some basic questions about if this intervention, does it make a difference or not? What do we mean by difference, and how do we measure it, and are the results we get credible? And I certainly understand the case for longitudinal studies. Do birds of a feather flock together, and so you want to separate the troubled kids, or is troubled early school behavior the result of recruitment into, quote, deviant networks of 8-year-olds? I understand those questions because they're narrow enough that they have some clear policy import. And if you were trying to do something to improve the world or improve humans' lives, you want to be able to answer questions like, just like you want to be able to answer the question about the visiting nurse and is it at high risk of mental disability. So I understand the focal work, and I understand evaluation research. I don't quite understand the grand theory. But I'm a lawyer. I never took a criminology course. Never taught a criminology course. I taught a little thing on crime policy for Wilson for a long time. I taught some sentencing courses in law schools 30 years ago. Did a couple of sentencing courses in Cambridge. So I'm not a criminologist. I'm a lawyer by training. I have no education in anything except law. So the things I just said were ignorant and offensive. Is what somebody says who doesn't know what he's talking about.
No, but at the same time, I mean, this fake anecdote that Laplace, when he developed this idea that if there was an intelligence that could foresee all the causes, all the movements that are going on at this moment, he or she could tell precisely what was going to happen after. So consequences, causes and consequences, and it is said that he presented this to Napoleon, which is surely fake, but the idea. So he said, okay, this is the demon of Laplace, this intelligence that knows everything. And Napoleon asked him, and where is God in this pattern that you present in this explanation? And he said, I didn't need that hypothesis. And so if I use this as a metaphor, you've been doing 50 years of research, and you didn't feel the need for these explanations. And I've been thinking about this because I have the impression, and probably Lieven surely thinks differently about this, that many of our theories are related to juvenile delinquency. And so the way in which criminology is taught, our students spend a lot of time with this. And then the practical aspects in which you've been working, they don't deserve enough attention. So I have the impression, but maybe I'm wrong, that it is because we want to have a science that has its own theories, and everything is explained in this way, and then in practice, we don't get the results that we should have. So you've been very pragmatical on this, on the way in which you've done your research, and I wonder if that is not the way to go if we really want to have an impact on the world.
Well, David Farrington years and years ago used to say, until he was told it really came across badly, he said, I have no interest whatever in policy. I want to understand how human beings develop. Now, that may have implications for policy, but that's not my job. My job is to try to understand. So David did have he doesn't say that anymore. Now he, but David had this idea of their science. And I think with American criminology, especially, but it's becoming more prevalent in Europe as well. The same thing is happening that happened with sociology in the U.S., which is that sociology was also a suspect social science for a long time, and probably still is in England. Where some universities don't have sociology departments because it's not considered. Well, even in Italy, University of Bologna does not have a sociology department, right? It's just, but but sociology became established. There were some very smart people who worked in it early in the 20th century. It began to develop reputation. People began to develop authority. They created departments. They created eventually career structures for people who thought of themselves as sociologists. And over time, career structure, sociology starts in Chicago and in the U.S. in a big way in the early 20th century as a problem-solving discipline. Just as criminology sort of started as a problem-solving discipline. But the scientification took over. Institutions and individuals have self-interest in having expertise. And psychological self-interest in being accorded authority. And so just as sociology became more and more quantitative, more and more removed from problem solving, I think in the U.S. criminology did the same thing. And since it happened in criminology at a time of the huge increase in technical sophistication in statistics and modeling, the tools that were available was that set of tools. And so those are the tools that are mostly used in the U.S. And there are all kinds of worthy things that get done with them. for sure. But it moved the academics further and further and further away from engaging with real-world problems. Certainly when I first started coming to Europe, there was David Farrington, and then there were some psychologists and medical researchers doing longitudinal studies of things. But this notion that that serious research almost invariably involved sophisticated statistical modeling, and ideally theory-guided original data collection, was not part of the intellectual ethos, I think, of criminology almost anywhere in Europe. Now, it was in things like it was beginning in things like psychology, I think, and in the medical and the behavioral science. In England, I was at Cambridge for 6 years, and when I got there, there weren't 10 people who could have succeeded in American criminology, partly because of the educational system in England, in which people make fundamental choices at age 15 for educational tracks, and if they don't want to be engineers, they take math and sciences, and if they want to be lawyers or sociologists or historians, they take English literature and French and history. And then when they get to university, they take a 3-year course that is only in their discipline. It's just the sociologists were not quantitative, the sociology lecturers are not quantitative, and the sociology course is not quantitative. And when I would get them at Cambridge, we'd have these people coming in to do a PhD who had never taken the statistics course. Which doesn't mean to say that every person who does work on crime should do it statistically. I have huge respect for ethnographers and some kinds of social theorists and so on, and lots of qualitative work. But in Britain, it just wasn't possible. Nobody could do that. and so in the year 2000, the only person people doing serious quantitative work in England on these issues, with ideological issues, were David Farrington and his groups, along with some psychiatrists, because people didn't have the skill to do it, and to some extent that remains the case in Britain. There are more people doing American-style research. The people at University College London, for example, are doing very quantitative kinds of stuff. There's some people in the crime prevention world who are doing other people in the crime prevention world. There are 3 or 4 nests of people doing longitudinal empirical things. But it's still the case that in Britain, the most criminology remains qualitative or theoretic. Rather than, I can't possibly begin to generalize in Europe, except that certainly for people not my generation, because I'm a really old guy, people I deal with who are, say, very few have significant quantitative skills. Yeah, at best they can do what I can do, which is go to a big data set and pull out some stuff to do some figures showing trends in something over a long time.
I mean, this idea of problem-solving criminology, I think, is very powerful. And so, if we go there, you said you arrived first in the UK in the 70s. Then few people were doing criminology. Then, in the 90s, criminology starts somehow, let's say, booming. What happened? Because you were there. How did you explain that we had 2,000 people in Malaga at the ESC? What?
Oh, I've got the answer for that is interesting to me. So I went to early criminology meeting. The first criminology meeting I went to was in San Francisco in 1980, when I went with a good friend of mine named Jones Peter Silliott, since deceased, whom I met because we commissioned her to write something for Crime and Justice. There were about 400 people there, and in recent years it's been 3,000 to 5,000, but it has been 3,000 to 5,000 for at least 20 years. In England, what is now the British Criminology, the annual meeting of the British Society of Criminology, was started by Ron Clark and somebody at York called the British Criminology Conference that met every 3 years, or every 2 years, I forget. And Ron invited me to the first one or 2 or 3 in York and in Cardiff and somewhere else. It was 60 people, 90 people at the early ESC meeting. A couple of hundred in Lausanne. And then we got to 200 or 300, 400 for about 6, 7, 8 years. All those experiences were experiences in which, if you were sort of an insider, if you knew somebody, you kind of knew a lot of people. If you saw people you know, you didn't have the sense that you were in a big anonymous setting, even if there were people you didn't know. Now, that's not quite answering your question. But in all three of those cases, well, not the British one. The British one never really turned out to be anything. But ESC is following ASC's model. And here's why. When, in 1967, the President's Commission on Crime and Law Enforcement in the U.S. issued its report and precipitated things like the victim surveys that we talked about earlier and the long-term studies in crime, it decided to invest a lot of money in educating police officers. That an educated gendarmerie would be a huge advantage. And so, an organization called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration had a lot of money, and it said, if you will organize a criminal justice department that will, in colleges and universities, that will provide training to police officers and give them bachelor's degrees after 4 years, we will give you money. And so, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration gave money to about 200 places. At that time, before they did it, there were only criminology departments in 2 or 3 or 4 universities in the U.S. It was Penn, because a man named Thorsten Saline had been, and actually that was a sociology department, but it was a criminology emphasis. The University of Maryland had a criminology department based around some Balkan immigrants from the 1940s. There were 4 or 5 criminology departments. Albany is an LAA-funded program. Rutgers is an LAA-funded program. Florida State is an LAA-funded program. They started as little police training colleges, but students liked them. And they started getting students who weren't policemen. And then there started being television shows about cops and eventually about the psychological, what the name is for the people who do forensic psychology stuff. Anyway, shortening the story, by the mid-1980s, criminology is becoming the most popular undergraduate course in America. Partly because there are a lot of programs, and so a lot of people just kind of stumbled into them. And partly because crime was in the news a lot. Get to the 1990s, there are 2,000 criminal justice departments. There are 150 PhD, 150 graduate programs, probably 50 PhD programs. There are academics who have a career in this field, and there are universities discovering in school after school after school that criminology is the most popular undergraduate major. So, same thing happened in England, but later. In England, in the early 1990s, the centralized education authorities decided to invest some money in criminology and criminal justice departments. Until then, you had Oxford, which was only graduate, Cambridge, which was only graduate, LSE, which had PhD, which I guess only graduate, and some courses in criminology taught in law faculties, sometimes by social science. But they set up a whole bunch of new departments. There was a place called Kiel. They did it in a bunch of universities. And the same thing happened. And at that point, the forensic psychology television series about people solving problems involving pathological issues were very, very popular. And so it went from, exactly followed the American trajectory. By the time I was at Cambridge, at Kiel, they had 800 undergraduates in criminology. The next biggest department had 350. and that's what happened in the Netherlands. I was actually had a 1-day-a-week appointment at University of Leiden law faculty in the late 1990s, very modestly. Ink van de Bunt, Erwin Brandsma, Ink van de Bunt twice, once for the VU and once for Erasmus. Maybe it was just the 3 of them. decided to establish an undergraduate degree in criminology in the Netherlands, which there had never been before. And because it's such a specialized subject, they realized that no university had enough people to teach a whole course, and they certainly couldn't invest a lot of money in hiring criminologists. So they decided to offer it at all three of those universities, and the professors would move around between the three universities, and they were hoping they'd get 60 or 100 students. So the first year they got 300, and a couple of years later they had 1,000. And at that point, the Dutch higher education rules, students are were entitled to be admitted to the course they wanted. If you were admitted to the university, you could choose your course. Unlike, say, the American model, the English model, where you have a certain number of slots and you admit people selectively to fill 150 spaces, you had to take everybody who wanted to study criminology. And then it's just metastasized since then. There were just a lot of kids interested in taking criminology courses. Here, in Hungary, Miklos Levész had, on a much smaller scale, that experience with his one program in Budapest. At the very beginning, hoping they would get 20 people, and then discovering the number just kept growing and growing and growing. So I don't have a good explanation for it, except for some reason, make their jobs, I guess. Our students believe their jobs. It seems probably more inherently interesting than a lot of things that you get. This is an administration degree or a communication degree. I don't know, but it's happened in a lot of places. And so the reason you have so many criminologists going to the ESC is, compared to 20 years ago when you started, you've got a bunch of universities that have criminology programs. Some undergraduate, some graduate, varies a lot between countries. You therefore have, just as in the U.S. in the 1990s, you have a cadre of professionals whose careers are premised on the idea of a career structure teaching criminology and doing the other things you have to do, which is do research and things that give you legitimacy and maybe help you get jobs or help you raise money to do other things you want to do. So it's not a surprising progression. Again, that was very long-winded. I would think it's terribly boring. But
it is a nice explanation. I mean, people got interested in criminology, then you produce criminologists, and they do research, and then they come to the meetings. I mean, the idea that this series in the 90s, that was true at the beginning, but now it is, as you mentioned, the fact that we are producing criminologists all the time. They do research, they need to get positions, so they need to publish, and this shows this big increase. And related to this, you were among the founding fathers of the European Society of Criminology, eh? Which is your recollection of that, of how that came to
move? I think Lieven probably has not heard me give this little performance, but Marcelo has several times. In my first year in Cambridge, which was 1999, went to the ASC, and which was, I think, in Toronto.
Yeah, I was in Toronto. 99 was Toronto.
Yeah, okay. Well, in any case, back a year before that, in 1998, yeah, when I was going to Cambridge, we noticed that, or it was the case that there were 400 people from Europe attending the ASC out of 2,000. Those numbers are both guesses approximation. And I had already been working for 7 or 8 years with a number of senior European academics. Of course, with the Brits, with Tilias, your predecessor at Lausanne, with Josijn Jongertas in the Netherlands, with Hans-Jörg Albrecht and Hans Karner in Germany, and some other people in other places. With the Kivsgaard in Denmark, And it just didn't kind of hanging around. We were speculating, why is it that there are so many Europeans at the ASC? And what some of them said, and what some of them said, other people said to them was, well, this is at least for internationally active people, this is the most efficient way to see other Europeans, which seemed a little crazy. And so when we got back, Yosine and I were working on a project together, one of my few projects that didn't actually come on, because we were going to try to establish case mortality studies in 6 countries for the processing of criminal cases from arrest through sentencing, in order both to have that comparative information, but in particular with an emphasis on minority groups. We wanted to see to what extent members of minority groups in different countries were treated differently at the different decision points. And that never came off because we just couldn't get governments interested in funding. But we've been working together, and so we started having conversations, and we decided to organize a meeting in Toronto. And so we had a small meeting of Yosine and her deputy, who was a man named Hans Botelier, who later went on to Utrecht. We invited Savona. We invited Half Kilias fell out of it, but he wasn't there. Kenner was there. I was there. I think I brought 1 or 2 of my people from Cambridge with me. And we decided, well, why don't we try to organize a European Society of Criminology? Hank van de Bunt was there. And Hank van de Bunt, but Kilias must have been there, I'm forgetting. Hank van de Bunt volunteered. He was then head of the VODC, the Research and Documentation Center of the Ministry of Justice. And he volunteered to spend the money to convene a meeting in The Hague to explore the possibility of creating a European Society of Criminology. And so 40 or 50 people, a little bit on Noah's Ark principle, trying to get a few people from each country to come, sat around for a day, and reached the foreordained conclusion that we have to try to establish a European Society of Criminology. There was a tension at the meeting that French people didn't like the idea at all. And for some reason, Hans-Jörg Albrecht, who was then the director of the Max Planck Institute, took the French position. So they opposed organizing a European Society of Criminology. And as Marcelo, as you both know, our French representation historically was very low. And you could name on one hand often the number of people, the people who came. Probably it's getting a little bit better now, but I don't know. But in any case, the rest of the people decided to do it. And Yosine, who had really been the moving force behind the Toronto meeting, and Martin agreed to do the work required to try to establish a European society and organize a first meeting, which Martin volunteered to have be in Lausanne, and he would take care of all the land and physical arrangements, and Yosine volunteered to take care of the program. And she would solicit abstracts and organize panels, and so the 2 of them did it. And the rest of it is history. Therefore, a couple of years later, this young Argentinian guy came stumbling into Kilias' office and said, "What on earth am I going to do with a criminology PhD?" And Kilias said, "Well, why don't you become the executive director of the European Society of Criminology? It'll give good networking opportunities, make you visible, and the rest is history." Right?
Yeah.
Where's the story?
No. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah.
Let me follow up with one. Officially, Martin Kilias was very professional in various ways. One I don't think was very smart. That he used the American Society of Criminology's paperwork and organization as a template, which I think was not great. There were some problems later on because of it. But he, in deciding where to organize it, he talked to business lawyers in the law faculty at Lausanne and discovered that the most permissive country in Europe for organizing nonprofit associations was Britain, because you had to file some papers and organize it. and then never had to make a report. He just existed. And so we did it in Cambridge. So until I guess a few years ago, Marcelo finally brought it to Switzerland, I guess. He was officially headquartered at the University of Cambridge. Now, I was involved all the time, of course, in making that happen and agreeing to that. But I had the thought that it looked inappropriate for an American to be playing a visible role in organizing a European thing. So for the first year, I stayed out. So there was a founding board that I was not on, which I purposely declined to be on, even though I'd already agreed that I would do the newsletter once we were going to have a newsletter. But I thought that just had a bad taste. So, but after that, until I stopped being president, I guess, in 2012 or 13 or 14, I was involved every year.
Yeah, thank you. That's a nice story. My recollection is also that it was after the 1998 conference, because Martin, in 1999, he started talking. He had this way of, when he had an idea, he would discuss it a little bit at coffee breaks, just to start working on that. And he said exactly what you said. So it's the same. You had that discussion, and he said, 400 Europeans crossing the Atlantic, this is completely crazy. And then there was this meeting. I remember also in 1999 in Toronto, a dinner in which Martin, there was Josine and Marianne Junger, her daughter, and my God.
She was probably at that meeting. I've forgotten her.
Yeah, and then they started presenting this idea. So, and it was quite quick. It was in 2000. It was already working, and so well, it
was 2001 was the first meeting.
Yeah.
So it took 4 or 5 months to go from the November meeting in Toronto to an April meeting in The Hague. And then I guess sometime the next summer is when we had the I don't remember what month it was, had the first annual meeting.
Yeah. So that's a nice story. And then one question that we ask always to the people that we invite to have an overview of. So you've been working in criminology for 50 years. What changed in this? Of course, I know many things changed, but what is the difference now? If you would, when you arrived to the field in the late 70s, compared to now, well, what has changed?
There is a field now.
Okay. Yeah.
Right in Paul Rock, an very smart English, now retired sociologist, an article, I think, in the first issue of the Oxford Handbook on Criminology, which is actually the Oxford Handbook of English Criminology, I leave the English out, on criminology career networks in England. We're talking about the 1990s now, right? And it turned out that, there were only like 70 people who counted as criminologists then. And they all was all very incestuous. Some had their roots at the London School of Economics with Mannheim, and some had their roots at Cambridge with Radzivovitz Most. And people from Cambridge had gone off to start Sheffield and to start Edinburgh. And people from the LSE had done something. So it was just a very small thing in the U.S. As I said, in the early 70s, there weren't any criminology departments. So there was nothing that would really count as criminology. It was a sort of an area preference. Well, it's an interesting thing to try to understand something about that. I don't think it was really thought of as a field mostly. As you know, Marcelo, in different countries it was very different things. In Britain, with the exception of what Norbert Morris used to like, he would use a fake accent that I won't do because I can't. But until the three great English criminologists And then he would say with a German Jewish accent, Karl Mannheim, Wolfgang Batzilowitz, Max Brunner. These three emigres from Nazism came to England in the 1940s and got adopted. Right? Universities finding homes for refugees at Cambridge, Batzilowitz, Oxford, the man whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, and LSE, Vermont. That's where English criminology starts. Before that, it's all psychiatry. And so the British, if you read the details on the inside cover of the British Journal of Criminology, it will say it is owned by the Institute for the Study and Treatment of Delinquency, the ISTD. That was an entirely psychiatric group which was interested in the treatment of delinquents. So you had the roots there. In most of Europe, my impression is that criminology was mostly people you would think of as criminal procedure specialists in law schools who had sort of an interest in policy, but not in a systematic, empirical way. They had opinions about policy, which made them criminologists. I think that in the 1970s, that's sort of the story almost everywhere. Just little groups of people, local, in Italy, as you know, it's forensics. Even now, I've only once been to an Italian Society of Criminology meeting, a pretty grim experience, I have to admit, because it's mostly forensics. It's mostly psychologists and an awful lot of people doing things on blood testing, which is okay, but not what I think of as criminology at all. But so I don't really have any answer for you. I don't really think of myself as a criminologist and never have. I think that there are huge advances in sophistication in the ways they know things. There's huge increases in the subtlety of some of the things that we know. And that's different, because then it was just, here's a big difference. But then it was, people knew the thing they knew and learned the things they learned through doing the things they did, and that was what made you into a criminologist. Now there are massive literatures on things, massive sets of skills depending on your specialty. I think this goes back to our earlier point about the increasing scientism of criminology and social sciences generally. The human beings who were criminologists, who were leading criminals, were much more interesting people. It's a horrible thing to say. It's not because they had, more charismatic personalities. It's because if you talk to Lloyd Olin or Noah Morris or James Q. Wilson or Zlatan Radzinovich or Nigel Walker, or if I could go on and on and give you a list of 20 names. They weren't working in narrow silos. That is, Noah Morris worked on police issues and sentencing issues and prison issues, and Albert J. Reese Jr. designed one of the two first victimization surveys, pioneered the first participant observation ride-along work in police cars, pioneered, although he gets no credit for it in retrospect, he pioneered the offender decision-making empirical research by adding into early rounds of the National Crime Victim Survey questions to offenders, questions about where did things happen, and figure out ways to identify, to track offenders' movements by tracking victims' movements in relation to where victims live. Al Reese did. He was one of the first people to take a serious interest in co-offending. He was a major white-collar crime figure. Well, now to find a person at peak of his or her career who was a major figure, 3 or 4 or 5 different subjects, is really rare. Really rare. I'm amazed with crime and justice. I publish things by really good people, and usually it's really good work of theirs, but they often don't know much outside their own silo, which sort of surprises me. And I don't. And I think, well, yeah, I think that may be more of a problem in Europe than it is in the U.S. because your educational systems are so different. In Britain, in most of Europe, if you take a 3-year sociology class or the course, or a 3-year law course, or a 3-year political science course, that's all you do. The American educational model has been for 200 years. You have a 4-year first degree, the first 3 years of which are entirely general. There are what are called, there's the Common Core requirement. You have to take 3 or 4 semesters of languages. You have to take 3 physical and biological sciences. You have to take at least 2 or 3 years of a language. You have to take 3 years of mathematics. You have to, and so, which means your 4th year, basically, is all sociology. But if you go on to do a sociology degree, you've got those other things behind you. Whereas if you do 3 years of sociology in Oxford and then 4 years of qualitative sociology at Cambridge, at the end of 7 years, you may know a lot of sociology and may even be quantitative sociology. But you probably don't know a whole lot about political science or economics or anthropology or history or a bunch of other things. I think in general, American academics were much less narrow 50 years ago, and that made them much more interesting people to hang around with than they are now. And I think to a much lesser extent, probably American academics tend to be a bit broader than European academics because of differences in the structure of the educational system.
Yeah, I think this is a major point because people, Europeans like to criticize the U.S.
I do too.
And these are the kind of things that are seldom mentioned. I mean, this idea, I was surprised, for example, when one of my former students in Barcelona went to the John Jay to do his PhD, and he was the only one with a background in criminology. The rest of the persons doing the PhD in criminology came from different fields. And this is more a tradition in the USA, of mixing not only this general background, and this is something that unfortunately is being lost, even in general. Not that you mention it, and now that you mention it, and it becomes more clear. It is true that they are making programs of 4 years in criminology, extremely focused on. And I don't know if you can. Of course, you can make 5 years of criminology. You could make it, but maybe it's a big mistake that we are making.
Yeah,
I have the impression that generation. I didn't met.
Well, that's an older generation altogether. Those are people who came of age in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, exactly.
I was including people like Marvin, like Nigel Walker or Lloyd Olin or Albert J. Reese Jr. in the U.S., James Q. Wilson. They are just people who had considerably greater intellectual breadth.
Yeah, I mean, now that you mention it, it is quite interesting because these big generalists that they are disappearing a little bit. More people are more focused on their research, and it becomes more difficult to. It's funny how you say that people to hang around. When you discuss with people and they have a broad view of life, is quite interesting. So that was a really interesting point.
We're only educated. My undergraduate degree was African history. And I have a little degree. Then it was true, and it is true still today, that if you look at recruitment materials of American law schools, it will almost always have a section answering students' questions. And you student, should I take undergraduate courses in law or legal studies? And the answer is always absolutely not. Absolutely not. Law school is where you can learn some law. You want to be as bring as broad an educational background for law. So, and it can be anything. You can study physics as an undergraduate, because even the physicists will have to take introductory economics and introductory sociology. Yeah. And you can, but the law schools always discourage people from taking law courses in undergraduate university, because you're Lieven, you're not a lawyer, are you? You're a sociologist? Okay. Well, I don't know about legal training in Europe. In American legal education, there is this idea that every lawyer ought to be able to argue any side of any question, that there are no ultimate answers to things, but there are better and worse arguments that may change over time and under circumstances. And that means you can't just go learn the law the way you can learn plumbing. And the belief about not taking undergraduate law courses is that people take many undergraduate law courses are taught by people who think they know what the law is. And so you don't want students to have this idea that there's a known physical black letter set of legal rules that are the law. And then in law school discover, well, no, it's not quite as simple as that. Everything is arguable. And
so I would like to ask one additional one, because of the idea of the possible danger of creating silos, the way you call it, the over-specialization. What are good remedies against over-specialization? Because obviously criminology also in Europe is very, very much in a phase of over-specialization. Nobody knows anything about anything else except over-specialization.
I'm more surprised in Europe than I am in England, because of this problem. Then you take sociology as an undergraduate and then sociology as a graduate student. But you have criminology programs with undergraduate criminology degrees, which ought to expose people to a wide range of different subjects. Well, the answer is it's the world we live in, isn't it? It's that science, especially if you're in scientific things, the science gets more and more sophisticated. The intellectual capital required to be at the cutting edge means you have to amass a lot of capital to be at the cutting edge of any specialty. Well, the literatures are getting so big and the specification of problems so small that, but it's the same thing in the behavioral sciences. There are people who specialize in eyes who only specialize in certain problems of the retina, and that's what they spend 30 years of a lifetime doing. I see a really fine heart doctor in Italy, who has a particular niche of a particular arrhythmic heart problem that he's doing research. So there's no reason why we wouldn't expect sociological criminology or psychological criminology to become very, very specialized. Well, curiously, in some fields it isn't. So in economics, when you look at work by economists they tend to identify some problem they think is really interesting, and then just look around and try to find a data set. Well, they develop some hypotheses, and they do a lot of testing, pre-testing, and then they work out a model, and then they test their model, but they may go on to a different one tomorrow. Well, next month, 6 months from now. But maybe that's because they don't really have a solid corpus of knowledge. If you ask David Farrington to talk to you really seriously about bullying in cross-culturally in different countries, varying with the age of the parents and the psychological profiles of the parents and the child, and there's things can add up, as in the medical research world. And if you discover that this works for 17 to 19-year-olds, you can then test it and see if it works for 21 to 23-year-olds. And if it does, you've made an advance, then you can. But I guess what the economists do isn't really like that, because it doesn't add up. People just keep testing whether something about crime influences local tax rates or influences pattern, the stability of land tenure. And they get an answer, and 30 different people do the same thing, and you get 30 different answers. And they cluster, but it doesn't really build in the way that taking the medical research problem now to the next step builds. That's why the citation analysis system that criminologists use is kind of a silly one, because it was for giving people credit for being successful. Because the standard norm now, you have to look at journals like the EJC and say, was the EJC ranked 10th or 22nd or 42nd out of 70 penology and criminology journal? And that's based on a measurement of the number of times it is cited in other journals that are part of the same database in 2 base years that ended a year before the year in which they're doing the calculation. Now, it's inefficient because almost by definition, things don't get cited 6 or 9 months after they're published. So it's really only like 15 months at risk, even for the oldest things. That works in the physical and biological sciences because knowledge advances in such little steps that if a doctor does an experiment with a certain medication for a certain condition for a certain category of patient and does it, somebody instantly replicates it, and then they move on to the next thing if the replication confirms the initial. And the results are used very quickly, and then they're obsolete. They're historical. Whereas in, say, history, people won't even know it exists for 5 years, but they may be reading it in 30. And in much of criminology, the things that we do aren't likely to get cited within 15 or 18 months from the time they're published. And yet, this idea of the prestige of journals is premised on frequency of citation in that little narrow window that doesn't really fit our discipline. But it's a cookie cutter problem. There's one system for everybody, and it started with the physical and biological sciences. I'm always much more interested in for things we do for the 5-year impact system, and for the half-life. There's a measure in that standard thing for how long do things on average get cited, and for something in physical sciences it's 2 years. Just 2 years, okay. For the good ones. In history, it's probably 30, but crime and justice, it's always had the longest citation life of anything. It's usually been 15 or 17 years is the average citation life. Whereas in lots of other journals, it's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. Well, that's really my measure that we're still doing relatively well because people keep paying attention.
I mean, your introduction to the issue on immigration and crime, which must be 25 years ago, it's still being quoted.
It's still citable, aren't it? Yeah, that's by far my widest cited article. I had no idea, so I started talking with I started working with a young German woman we've met named Sandra Bucerius in Canada, who's an ethnographer who was working on immigration in her early career. And I interviewed her in Canada for I've done a site visit for the Toronto Criminology program, and critical review of their work. And I met this young German woman, and Michael Tonry, this is so wonderful. So you're a legend. Yeah, I'm a legend. Nobody can write about immigration and crime without citing you. And I didn't know that. I had no idea. But it turns out that article still gets cited 40 or 50 times a year, 25 years later. And it's obvious because nobody else has done what I did, just combine historical and comparative stuff on that subject. So that one gets citable hard. But David Farrington's Age and Crime, 1984, is cited 50 to 100 times a year. Some of these things just become kind of landmark, much more than my ethnicity. But what do I see? I've got a number of things that I put on it. There are a variety of people who've done things in crime and justice that just get cited and cited and cited and cited. Yeah. Occasionally, I in moments of vanity, I've written in it that I've just looked to see. I remember once looking up something for Al Blumstein on Google Scholar, and seeing that his second or third most cited article was in crime and justice. And I started looking, and for almost all major American and some British criminologists, they over age 50. It turns out that if you look at one of their 5 most cited things, damn naked, 2 or 3 of them are in crime and justice. So, but that's what we were trying to do, right? We were trying to establish exhaustive, smart overviews of things that other people could build from. And clearly it's happened.
You succeeded, it's clear, and the quality of the articles is incredible. But in any case, this idea of combining different, there are still persons that can combine different approaches, and I think it's related to what you said about over specialization. It's going to be even harder to find this kind.
I think about painters. It's not inevitable. It's not in it. I have a lot of painter friends, and I look at a lot of painting. And you see one model. You see a lot of really talented people who at some point find something that they're good at, and then they do it for the rest of their career. In Henning Mankell's Kurt Wallander mystery stories, that you may have read some of. So, Lieven, do you read mystery novels?
Sometimes.
Kurt Wallander is the policeman of Henning Mankell in the Stadt, a little town in. And one of the devices in it is he always has this guilt relationship about his father, who lives by himself and is a widower, and he goes to visit the father regularly, guiltily, and the father reminds him how long it's been since he was there. And his father is a painter. And for 35 years, he's been painting the same painting. It's a particular kind of bird that lives in the Scandinavian woods. And sometimes it's wintry setting, and sometimes it's in the spring, but it's the same painting. And I know lots of artists, who basically find something, and that's what they do. And they're really good at it, and that's wonderful, and that's great. But then there are really gifted people like the Picassos, to take obviously the polar outlier, who did many different things at different times in his or her life. And so bringing that grandiose comparison down to the mundane and the grandiose, my young friend Sandra, who was an ethnographer, primarily exclusively qualitative, did 5 years working with Turkish drug gangs in Frankfurt for her PhD, and then started doing some immigration stuff in Toronto, working with people from Bangladesh and from Somalia. But now she's the overseer of the largest, most sophisticated prison culture study that's ever been done. She was the first person to get permission to go inside Canadian prisons to do sustained interview and observational work with prisoners and staff. And so they've got 3 or 4 provincial and 3 or 4 federal prisons that they've been doing systematic interviews over a number of years. And so she still has immigration in her quiver, to use the American Indian metaphor, the arrows in the quiver. But she now has prisons era, and she has a police era, because she started working in a serious way, doing some ethnographic work with police in Alberta. But she's consciously wanted to keep broadening her horizons. I've done it a little, because in Europe nobody would know this, but I'm most known in the U.S., except in my immigration specialist, for working about race. Probably in Europe I'm best known, if I'm involved, but maybe for just editing crime and justice. That's probably what I'm based in. In the English-speaking countries generally, I'm basically known for sentencing. And what I discovered is And that's calculated, because I haven't wanted to become like Kurt Wallender's policeman's father. and so I've purposely kept moving my focus in discovery. And that once you have the capital stock in a subject, like sentence, for which I was the guy for 15 years in the that doesn't go away. I mean, I have a wood retentive memory, and the major changes in knowledge or understanding or conceptualization are relatively few over time. And so it turns out I've periodically gone back and done another book on that, or I just did an article for something that comes out in a couple of months that pulls something together in light of, and so you can do that if you really strategic decide that you don't want to become Kurt Wallender's father. I know lots of criminal law guys who are Kurt Wallender's father. They taught criminal law and criminal procedure and advanced criminal law in law schools for 40 years.
Yeah, at the same time, I think that what is less known here is your work in the field of philosophy. Because you have all...
There's another group of people with them because of the philosophy stuff.
Exactly. I mean, but this is almost unknown, I think. And there you have another window completely.
Well, so I'm known among immigration people really for that one article and a few other things. Sadra and I did a big handbook on ethnicity, crime, and immigration that actually does get cited a lot by immigration scholars. But yeah, in the world of philosophy and what's called criminal law theory, I'm pretty well known. Not for sentencing or race or immigration, but for the philosophy stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to mention as we talk about Wallander and Henning Manning, I always remember that you also had with you a book with that short story of Jorge Luis Borges, theme of the traitor and the hero.
Oh yes, no, I have by my bed, I have Montaigne's essays. I have a big complete volume of Borges and 2 or 3 other books that I read something from at least every other night of my life. Now I read Borges all the time. It says I read Montaigne all the time.
How did you arrive to Borges?
Well, he's this remarkably creative man. You should know that.
I know it. I'm a fan of Borges, but I was so surprised that you are rereading it, because I remember Hemingway was reading King Lear every year, and you told me that I didn't want to misquote you. That's why I mentioned one particular book. But I wonder, how did you arrive to Borges?
Well, see, I think it's that you stumble on things. Yeah. I think I probably somewhere read something about Borges, or read some little. Oh, I know what it was. It's that I was reading Italo Calvino, Italian intellectual and writer, and publisher, who did a book called Invisible Cities. And he did 2 really interesting books. He did a book called Invisible Cities, in which he imagines these incredibly fantastic medieval city, and he describes them in huge detail for 5 or 6 pages, and then another one. And he has a second book called If on a Wintry Night a Traveler. And If on a Wintry Night a Traveler is a work of fiction, which is the first 5 to 7 pages of 50 different novels. That is, he starts a novel, sets a stage, creates characters, and then something happens and it's over. And I think I was reading a review of one or the other of that, and somebody said, not since Borges has anybody had this kind of... And I thought, I better find out about Borges. I discovered there was this little book published, the first thing in English, 60 years ago, when he had a visiting professorship at the University of Texas, and somebody there translated, the 30 of his little stories and 10 of his poems, and I got that book in the 1960s. And there are images in Borges that still stick in my head. all then that it's not that sometimes not a day goes by that I don't think of them. That's not true. But they're always there. The Roman soldier was lying in a field someplace beside a ditch, dying. And he was hungry, didn't have enough food, but now there's no sense of hunger any. And he's going to slowly pass away. And with him, Jesus will die. Because he will be the last living human being who actually was in the presence of tears. And that image is just stuck in my head. But I can give you another 30 Borges images that Tonry. And if you think about that, I said it very badly. I didn't say it in an elegant way. There's a lot to think about in what I just said. About the soldier, about how it is that he's dying, that way he doesn't regret that he's dying, and doesn't feel the pain anymore. But his dying is momentous. That could be like a dog lying along the road dying. There's something momentous about it. And there are a lot of other things to think about. I used to teach literary criticism. I taught short story writing for a long time.
You used to teach literary criticism.
Yes, and I taught classes on writing short stories.
And you wrote short stories too? And they are published?
Yeah, all under pseudonyms.
And we can we know the pseudonym?
Then ago. But for 20 years, I taught every year. Well, not 20 years. Yeah, I probably 15 times at Minnesota. I did a seminar on writing short fiction. Back where they would actually write short stories and go through drafts and read them out loud and all that stuff.
Wow. That I didn't know at all. Huh? Borges, yes, because I remember discussing about theme of the traitor and the hero, but this is new because, you know that I also published one book of short stories, but I was not clever enough to publish under a pseudonym. Now I have to. So this opens for people who will hear this podcast also the possibility of doing research to find which are the pseudonyms.
Anybody is going to sit through 2 hours of this, and
you never know. We put some extras also. It's no, I was really interesting, and this last part was incredible. So I mean, thank you very much, Michael. Really for your time, and I learned a lot as always discussing with you. I mean, it's food for thought. You know, it's having clever conversations is becoming very difficult because we have a lot of conversations via the telephones. You know, and so I really enjoyed this time. It's like being out of the world for some minutes. Then it's like a drug. I get high, and then I will go to the swimming pool. Because it's always very interesting. Thank you very much, Michael.
So why did you do Frank Zimmerman? He knows nothing about Europe, but he's much brighter and more interesting than I am. You'd enjoy.
Okay. We'll do it because we need to enlarge. We're trying to. We'll do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. Sorry we had to horse around for about an hour until my machine.
It was perfect. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte, and Alejandro Turco Gujot. Your hosts are Lieven from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.